Now, what I did yesterday is I selected me 2 dead standing red cedars. And that's what these are right here. As you can see, they're very dead. We'll come back and we'll cut them down later. But I cut them down. There's a bigger one. I drug them up to the fire barrel with my tractor and cut them up. And we have different trees that we will try to find that are dead standing. I like to use deadfalls. I will not cut the green trees down unless I have to. This one right here is a cherry. Cherry is on my list. There's several dead cherry trees back here that are still standing. This one is not dead, but it's a good example of what the bark looks like. Sorry about that, I tripped on something. So that's a cherry tree on my shoe. Excellent. So we have cherry trees, we have oak trees, willow trees, a couple of types of oak trees, hickory and pecan. Those are the ones, and pine, and those are the ones that I will work on later. It takes about 2 days to burn what I need to burn. I think it's a poplar. You see a great big cedar tree over there. I have lots of cedars to burn. So this is where this starts. If you don't have access to wood like I do, you can always burn pallets. A lot of those are made out of white oak. Collect up your pallets, tear them up, and burn them. And that will get you your ash for the project. Now, this is really simple, but you do need some tools. In fact is, if you really want to get simple, what I would suggest that you do is get you a couple of bags of charcoal briquettes. Burn them. They're usually hickory or pecan or a mixture, but it's close. They're all in the same family. Get your charcoal briquettes and burn them to a white powder. Sift it and go from there. So that's where this journey starts. From there, I drag them up here to the fire barrel. We have, when we sit around during hunting season or whenever anybody wants to sit around and shoot the bull and start a fire, that's what this is for. But I dragged them up here with my tractor. As you can see, I messed up the yard, but it's okay. It'll grow back. I have red oak today. It's been going since about 8 o'clock this morning. I already had a helicopter flying around to see what was on fire. Hopefully they seen the fire barrel and went away. But that will burn. I will keep it burning all day long until I burn up a fair amount of this red oak right here. Not so much all of it, but a good bit of it till I think I have enough ashes. That is where this journey really starts. You need ashes. Okay, let's start with a few of the things you're going to need. You're going to need a wheelbarrow or something metal that you can dump your ashes into. I let the ashes sit all night long. Most of the time, they're pretty much cooled off. But you want to make sure that you have something in case there's some live embers that you won't melt like your plastic wheelbarrow. And then you're going to need some sifters. I start with this little baby right here, which is my all-purpose clay sifter or whatever. It's a mesh of about like screen wire. And then I go and I use this little thing here. It's about maybe 50 mesh, I think. I made it. It works great for the powder that I need. Now, if you feel that that you need to go to finer meshes, you can buy a set of these things. I just happen to have two. They're part of a set. One of them is 100, and one of them is maybe 70. I don't know. They wouldn't tell you. They called it something else. They didn't call it by the mesh. But you can buy a whole set of these things, from quarter-inch course all the way up to 100 mesh. So if you want, that's not a bad investment. If you're going to be sifting a lot of things like glazes and clays and gold and stuff. They also work really good on your ashes. Now, they're plastic, so remember what I said about making sure they're cool. So that's what you'll need. You'll sift all of those big chunks out, throw them away. I throw them in my driveway, around my shop, and pretty much that's it. Let's go inside, and I'm going to show you what you end up with, okay? Okay, y'all have seen what we started with, what we ended with. You've taken a little walk in the woods with me this morning, and you've looked at the fire barrel and how I actually burn my wood. Explained to you how I sift it. Now, when I sift it, I end up, of course, with that really coarse charcoal that I throwed on the road out there. You saw that. But I end up with this. This is the sifted material through what I assume to be about a 50 mesh. Have not tried this through 100 yet, or 70, but I will next time. And you end up with this right here, which is very coarse, and you can save it and try it, experiment if you want to, or anything. I throw it away. But this is what we want right here. This is the ash. Now, I don't know a lot of technical stuff about ash glazes, except what goes into it, and I know what happens, but it doesn't get any simpler than this. Ash. Any kind of ash you want to use. It can be wheat straw, it can be bamboo, it can be oak, pine, a mixture. Any kind that you want. It's going to give you a different effect, the experts say. But I don't know what. That's what I'm doing now. Now, you're going to need some clay to go with this. This recipe that I'm using is an experimental one. I'm just going 50-50, and then I will adjust the recipe for more ash and less clay as it progresses. Clay, whatever you have. This is Kentucky Ball. It's white. It'll give you a lighter finish, kind of like this. This is red oak, and some 04, just 04 clay that I had. It was wet. I mean, it was just the kind that you made things out of. I didn't even try it. I just kind of measured it out 50-50 and did it. This little rascal right here was the first glaze that I did, and it was just come right out of the ashes out of the fire barrel. Boy, it's been burning all kinds of things in there. And there's aluminum cans, and I had did some pit fire, and there was salt and copper and aluminum foil and every kind of ash you can think of. And this was fired to cone 10 too, and so it's a little darker. Now, back to the clays. You have ball clay, which is white. You have this, I think it's Kentucky red clay. If you want a darker glaze, this is just some 04 slip, just standard low fire slip, which is scrap, and you can use it. It fires white. And this is my river clay, which, by the way, went into this, was all that messy ashes I was telling you about in river clay. Very first thing that I did. You just mill it up any way that you want to mill it up. If you put it in with all this stuff and you start to stir it, let it sit, it'll eventually turn to mush anyway. It'll just take a little longer. That is all you need. You need water. It doesn't have to be still. It can be out of your spigot. clay, and ash. Water, clay, and ash. That's all the materials that you are going to need. In this case, it's 50-50. There's 8.3 ounces of white ball clay. There's 8.3 ounces of ash. As you can see, there's more volume in the ash. Don't know about the water. It's not important, because if you put too much in, you just let it settle and siphon it off. Well, don't siphon it with your mouth, because this stuff's going to make some type of sodium hydroxide. That's what ashes do when they get in water. They make potash or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, get the water off if you have too much water. If you don't have enough water and your glaze is too thick, you guys know the routine. Add a little water. You're going to need a blender, my choice, or you can go old school and you can have a spoon. But it's as simple as this. I just happen to have a bunch of these. You don't have to have glass. My second favorite is the plastic buckets, the 2-gallon plastic buckets and stuff come in. But I happen to have about 2 dozen of these things that I had put soap in at one time, and no longer use them. Here's what I'm going to do, which is going to do real quick. I want this to be a short video. I'm just going to dump this in here. I'm going to dump my ashes in there. Stir them up. Now you can use a mask on this. It wouldn't hurt to use a mask. I don't have a mask on, but I'm a dummy. Use a mask, use your gloves, use your eye protection. I wear glasses, so I always have eye protection. But you see, it's causing a little dust down there, so yeah, use your mask. Please use your mask. I'm so old, it ain't gonna kill me tonight, so no time soon. Stir it up. We won't stir it up just horrible. Now that's not much water. I have some extra water over here. Pour the water in. Start stirring. See, right quick, that's not going to be enough water. So you'll pour a little more water in. Just like mixing concrete. Just kind of mix it or plaster. Might have put a little too much water in at that time. Who knows? But now, just because you don't think you have enough water in it, don't worry. If it's still, if it looks a little, let me back up. Don't worry if you think you put too much water in. Let this stuff sit overnight, and it will hydrate. There are things in it, especially the clay, that are going to absorb some of your water. And you'll have things that'll float to the top. They'll need to be stirred back in. In essence, that's it. You can take, we won't dirty up my blender, because you stick your blender in there and just blend the heck out of it. I'll do that later. And, also label your top so that you'll know all of it looks alike. All of it looks alike. Now here's some of the second that I blended up, or mixed up, excuse me. It is red oak and that 04 just regular old clay that I was telling you about. It's 04. And you can see it's about how thick it is. Now, this stuff here, depending on your clay body, you can dip it, you can brush it, you can do whatever you want to do to it. This is a piece I just did a while ago. I dipped one half, I brushed one half, but I can tell you what'll happen on this half, on this Red River clay. It is so porous it'll crack. It'll crack all up. When you fire it up to cone 6, it gives it an interesting effect. But a lot of times I don't want it cracked, so I'll brush it on, I'll put 2 or 3 coats on, and it doesn't crack up as much. Now, with that said, let me go over a few things. This is a cone, I would say 5, 6, 7 glaze. I fired it to 10. Make sure that, I don't know what it'll do. You take all the precautions you need to take with your kiln. I fire it at cone 6. Experiment, I will, and see what it'll do at all the other cones. You can use the clay you use. I don't know what this Kentucky ball is.
what it's considered. But the clay is not what glosses up. I think the clay holds it in suspension along with, if you wanted to put something else in it. I don't. But the ash actually is what melts and causes the shiny parts. It causes the shiny parts when it gets to a certain temperature. It melts. The ash is what does it. Exactly what the ball of clay does, I don't really know. That's an ignorance on my part. You guys look it up. I can't do everything. I'm too old. But that's it. Experiment with your different ashes or whatever you can get. Be careful with your fire. But that is all you need. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler than river clay with no additives, ashes or whatever you can burn, water out of the spigot, and whatever clay you have available. Then you should have some. You're a potter. Mix it up good, let it sit overnight, apply it to some vessel of your choice. Stick that rascal in the kiln, fire it, and you see what you get. Hey, that is my tutorial, if you will, on making a simple ash glaze. Folks, it don't get no simpler. So, make you some, enjoy it, let me know how it come out. You have comments, put them below. We'll discuss it. The adult, I will too. And I've really enjoyed making this, and I can't wait to make some more. I'm Captain Mike. I'm out of here.
Imagine you go into a medieval city for the first time. Maybe you're a peasant, you've spent most of your life living in a village. The sounds of the city, the scale of it, the busyness of it must have been amazing. You're going to have the metalworkers hammering away. You're going to have the cries of the pie sellers and the peascod hucksters. You're going to have the smell of animals. You're going to have the smell of horse dung on the street and oxen dung. You're going to have the noise of wheels. You're going to have everybody crowded together in an incredibly complex and busy environment. If the wind's in the wrong direction, you're going to smell the tanneries as well and their stench. Everything is going to be very different. But there is one thing all of those people that work in a medieval city have in common. What is it? Busy working men and women were the lifeblood of the growing urban economy in medieval England. And by the 12th and 13th century, it's almost certain you would have been a member of a guild, a specific craft guild for the job you were doing. Those guilds provided a monopoly in that local area to the people that were part of it. Guilds were much more than just trade associations. They were the lifeblood of many aspects of medieval urban life. Historically, guilds form into two broad categories. You had the craft guilds, the people that made things out of raw materials, and you also had the mercantile guilds. And you see the guilds of merchants that sold finished goods. Craft guilds came in all sorts of flavours. There were dyers, tinsmiths, blacksmiths, hatters, purse makers, girdlers, fishmongers, goldsmiths. Any trade you could think of was represented by a guild, and some of the guilds actually were very small parts of it. So if you were a blacksmith and you were making armour for somebody, and that person wanted it gilded, well, you needed to give that armour to the goldsmiths guild to get the decoration put on it. There were some unusual guilds in the medieval period. Gong farmers, for example, those people who euphemistically took out the night soil, the human waste of a night. They took it away. Initially, it was sold to farmers and spread over land, so it had a certain value. They would also empty cesspits. They were the ones that were allowed to empty the cesspits. And we know that a lot of cesspits overflowing caused quite a lot of court cases, because we have records of a lot of court cases of dangerous cesspits. Occasionally, the noxious fumes caused them to die as well, so it wasn't without risk. The gong farmers actually, strangely enough, became very wealthy as a guild because in the later medieval period, the raw material for gunpowder was sourced from, amongst other things, human waste. Along with the gong farmers, there are some other unusual guilds. There were the girdlers, for example, who made all kinds of belts. There were also the scriveners. These were professional writers. Now, it's plausible that most people could write and read, at least partly, in the urban medieval environment. Maybe not the poorest people, but lots of people could read and write, but not necessarily very well, and not well enough to make presentable documents. So scriveners' tasks were often to dictate letters in a slightly formal way, to put things down for the courts, for example, and just to write nice letters in good handwriting to be sent to somebody else. Quite where the trope of adventurers guilds or thief guilds comes into it, beloved of fantasy novels. I don't think I've come across anything like that in the historical record. However, there is a fighters guild. There appears to be in Anglo-Saxon, a few Anglo-Saxon documents, I think called a frith guild or a knighten guild, which seems to be an organisation, a sort of brotherhood of fighting men. So that's plausible. The concept of the guild is not medieval. It goes back a lot earlier than that. We have records from ancient Rome of things called collegia, which are associations, trade associations. They seem to have died out post-Roman in what used to be known as the Dark Ages or the early medieval period. We don't really hear much about trade guilds as such, or towns and cities, possibly because there wasn't much trade. But they really come into their own later on, and they still exist, of course. Guilds are still a thing today. So what did guilds actually do? Well, they managed and regulated a specific trade in a specific area. They were a legal monopoly with all the good and bad things that could be associated with that. Typically, guilds organised the trade. They controlled prices. Controlled prices were a big thing in the medieval period. Yeah, inflation was simply controlled by not allowing prices to go up, apart from very specific circumstances. For example, beer brewing was a set price unless the raw material, barley, prices had gone up, and then they could put the prices up a little bit. But broadly speaking, you knew what you had to pay for a certain thing in a certain way. Theoretically, they controlled the quality as well, and they had an organisation which restricted foreigners, and by foreigner I mean somebody not from the local area, so not from another country but from the local area. They restricted foreigners doing trade that was competitive as well, in some cases banning it outright, or in other cases charging an extra tax on those foreigners doing business in the local area. It's a good thing or a bad thing depending on your perspective. There wasn't really a free market in the same way, and guilds prevented that very much. They controlled the market in certain goods and services. Guilds played a very significant role in society in medieval towns and cities. They provided welfare for members that had fallen on hard times. They also generated social events, and the senior guild members actually became amongst the top non-noble members of society. The Council of Guild members was incredibly powerful and negotiated directly with the top nobles or even with the king. Nobody could cross the guilds and get away with it. Guilds contributed to the broad social life of a town or city. They put on festivals, they provided events, they often rented their rooms out to the local people for events, and they seemed to take their civic responsibilities very seriously indeed. Medieval guilds were very hierarchically structured, as you can imagine. Most things in the medieval period were. They were usually run by a group of senior, experienced craftspeople, usually men, called wardens in some cases. They had lots of different names. Their job was to manage the guild, but also manage the quality of the output of the guild members. They were there to ensure that the guild's good name was maintained amongst the general population. They were also there to adjudicate disputes between guild members, to supervise the training of new people that were entering into the guild, and to have a role in the social life of the town or city, and to negotiate with the noble powers of the day. Not all guilds were incredibly powerful. Some were very small and very minor, although they were probably important locally. But some guilds, especially the mercantile guilds, became as powerful as city-states. They became nations in their own right and had armies. And they dealt with kings and emperors as equals. The first rung of guild membership was the apprentice. These were usually boys or young men, certainly somebody in their early teens, who was apprenticed to a master in their workshop. They didn't get paid. They did get food and lodging, though, which is not to be underestimated in the medieval period. I mean, being housed and being fed were crucially important. The guild master's job was to teach the apprentice the skills of the job. These tasks often were very menial to begin with. Part of the job, probably for an early apprentice, was just to watch what was going on and probably sweep up at the end of the day. They were occasionally treated badly, although there were standards for treatment and types of food they had to eat, for example, but I'm sure there were abuses that went on. But broadly speaking, it was considered to be very lucky to be apprenticed to a guild master, whatever that guild would be. Maybe gold farmers were not so popular, but maybe they were wealthy and powerful, and that was meaningful in the medieval period. Apprenticeships typically were for a set period of time, so 5 to 7, sometimes 9 years. That's what you would expect to spend as an unpaid intern, if you like, an unpaid apprentice learning the craft. You would likely do more and more things as you went on, so as you'd spent a couple of years watching, you might do some of the very basic tasks. Once you finished your apprenticeship, you became what's called a journeyman, a man who could charge for the day's work. Journey as in journeying as well, because some journeymen actually travelled and sold their masters' goods. They would literally have pattern books. Armourers, for example, would have pattern books. They would go to the castles of the rich nobility and say, would you like a new suit of armour? Here's what my master can build. They would then take the order, go back, and the master and the apprentices and the other journeymen would make it, and it would then be delivered. So journeymen did journey, but that's not the direct derivation of the title. The title comes from journée, as in day, which means they could now charge for their work each day. They could also work for different masters as well. So you had certain skills, but you were not a master. To become a master, you needed to be qualified. You need to do a masterwork, a masterpiece. That's where the term comes from. A very good piece of work, which was judged by the other masters of the guild. And if it was found, presumably politics took a role here, but if it was found that the masterpiece was good enough, you would potentially be voted in as a fellow master. And then you could have your own studio, have your own apprentices, journeymen, and you would have a seat on the guild council, possibly. Although not all masters were wardens, so perhaps there's another hierarchy to go up to. You have to become a very well-known master to become on the guild, on the board of the members of the guild. Older apprentices seem to have become quite frustrated. Not every apprentice could become a journeyman, and some seem to have behaved badly enough that their apprenticeship was extended. One of the punishments for bawdy behaviour, drunkenness, or excessive fighting was to have your apprenticeship lengthened, which meant you had no free money. I don't quite know where they got the money for their drinking or their bawdiness from, unless they had side jobs perhaps, but basically apprentices were not supposed to have their own money. It was when you became a journeyman that you started to earn your own living. But it appears that apprentices became sometimes quite frustrated, and we have a lot of records of apprentices of different guilds fighting each other. In 1327, the apprentices of the saddle makers and the apprentices of the bit makers, two very similar trades you might think, they came to physical blow on the streets of Cheapside and Cripplegate in London. In 1339, fishmongers were involved in major street battles with goldsmiths. In 1517, frustrated apprentices seem to have attacked wealthy merchants, foreigners and bankers, and many were hanged for their crimes. Guilds usually operated under a set of written down rules, and we have some of these. They still exist, and they are wonderful pieces of work. The Hatters Guild of London in 1347 wrote down specifically that 6 of the most honourable and trusted hat makers of the town were to be called wardens and to guide the guild. We also know why they wanted to set up a guild, and I'm going to read this out because the language is absolutely wonderful. What they said was, some workmen in the trade have made hats that are not high quality, and this deceives the common people and brings great scandal, shame and loss to the good folks of the hatter's trade. Therefore, no workman in the trade shall do any work by night, but only in clear daylight, when the wardens may openly inspect their work. These are trade standards that are really interesting. They also go on to talk about the punishment, and they say, anyone who does otherwise shall pay a fine to the council chamber for the first and second offence, and the third time shall lose his freedom. Now, losing your freedom wasn't actually going to jail. There weren't that kind of things in the medieval period. It's far too expensive to keep somebody in prison. They were, but there were lockups usually for drunkards, so you just chucked in there, the door would be locked, you'd be let out the next morning with a massive hangover. But what they meant by losing your freedom was that they would say that you were no longer a free man of the town. Now, all guild members had to be freemen of the town they were in. And if you lost the freedom of the town, it meant that you could not be a guild member, and it meant that you could be thrown out of the guild, and you would not be allowed to pursue your job in that local area. That was a disaster. You would be lacking any kind of economic status whatsoever, and maybe you'd have to leave and go somewhere else. Maybe the rumours would follow you and you couldn't become a hatter elsewhere. What actually happened to hatters that were flung out of the Hatters Guild? We just don't know. There are no records of it. But maybe they wandered to another place and made bad hats in another town and got thrown out again. Or maybe they just became wandering vagabonds or wild hat makers working in the wilderness, making bad hats for travelling adventurers. I don't know. But it's interesting they had those specific rules. They were very much trying to maintain the reputation of the guild members. Merchant guilds were associations of traders dealing with the sale of goods. Some of the sale of goods was across national boundaries, so they would be involved in international shipping. They also created things like share ownership. They created things like insurance and banking and promissory notes. So the mercantile guilds really underpin much of the modern day capitalist structure that exists today. An awful lot of it can be traced back to the inventions of the mercantile guilds, particularly in Italy in the late medieval period. Many guilds have of course gone away in the modern day, but some are continuous, and to this day there are guild members in major places, particularly in London. There are a lot of guild members in London. There's well over 100 official guilds. They're called livery companies today. They don't have monopolies over certain trades, but they are influential, and in some cases they do control a lot more than you might imagine. Some modern guilds, obviously, are new inventions.
Order submitted.
You can argue that, in fact, the goldsmiths turned into bankers.
Medieval people obviously suffered the same kind of crimes that we do. Murder, theft, robbery, arson, fraud. Not murder, interestingly, if you're an Englishman at a certain time period. But broadly speaking, the same kind of crimes we suffer from today. However, there are a number of specifically medieval crimes, and weirdly, one or two of them are still in operation today. Let me tell you all about it. In the wrong place at the wrong time. Duke William, now King William of England after Hastings, set aside vast swathes of England to be forested, or afforested, turned into the Silver Regius, or the Kingswood, that's in Latin. And these were specific areas of the landscape reserved for Duke William and his cronies to go hunting, basically. Vast preserves. There were special rules about what you could hunt and what you could do to protect the deer and boar in particular, but also they restricted what you could do in terms of gathering wild food, hunting yourself, even what you could do with the trees and chopping things down and how you used the wood. This obviously is made beloved of the Robin Hood stories. This is probably why Robin Hood was made so famous, because he lived in Sherwood Forest. Now, forests aren't necessarily all about trees. We see it on telly all the time, you know, the forests of Sherwood, outlaws in green or motley or whatever it might be, charging through the trees. Now, there were areas of trees, but forest included woodland, plains, marshes, all the areas set aside for hunting. So some of the areas would have been open. There would have been villages and even towns sometimes in the forest area. One of the reasons behind the forest laws was to protect the venison and the vert, the animals like deer and boar, and the greenery, the verts, the greenery that they depend on. You could argue, if you're putting a very positive spin on the afforestation laws, that it was amongst the first types of environmental protection legislation. I think that's probably going a bit too far, but it did preserve the landscape, much to the annoyance of the people. In 1198, the punishment prescribed for killing the king's deer in the forest was castration or blinding, so extremely serious punishments. A chap called Hugh the Scot in 1209 was caught red-handed doing this, and he ran away and sought sanctuary in a local church. He stayed there for many months, claiming protection of the church. Now, presumably he was fed and watered by the clergy, by the ordinary people, and under the laws of sanctuary, you couldn't be taken away. So he stayed there for many months, and then he disappeared. And I think it's likely that he obviously lived there and he stayed there, and there were lots of comings and goings and lots of events. And I think the record mentions that he may well have dressed up as a woman and escaped with the crowd leaving after a service. What happened to him afterwards, we don't know, whether he was caught or whatever. But, you know, it was a very serious crime and very serious punishment. And that particular area of the law, because the laws were repealed fairly soon after, so only about 25 years worth of this very, very harsh forest law, they're probably the catalyst for all of the Robin Hood tales, the tales of abuse of the local people and people kicking the yoke of the forest law. For about 20 years it lasted, and then the laws were modified to big fines rather than castration and blinding and losing your fingers or whatever it might be. The laws were very, very seriously moderated. And I think it's likely that that's the time period when the legends of Robin Hood really take hold in the public awareness. Telling tales about posh people. Scandalum magnatum was a law enacted in 1275 and kept going till about the 19th century. It was meant to prevent you from telling tales and spreading malicious gossip about the great men of the kingdom, as the legislation puts it. Women are not mentioned, common people are not mentioned. You're just not supposed to gossip about the rich and powerful. It appears, though, that the rule was largely used to control political dissent, so the king used this as a way of controlling the political commentary. So it wasn't really used for ordinary people, but it was still there technically, and you could be done for telling tales about the posh. In complete contrast to Scandalum magnatum, there was a crime of being a grumpy and troublesome person for ordinary people. That was called being a scold. Being a scold was somebody who spoke badly about other people, was just angry and grumpy all the time. Typically, this appears to have been directed at women, mostly married women. About 10% of the court records talk about men and women, usually husband and wife teams of grumpy scolds. So scold doesn't technically mean a woman who's breaking the law, but it was mostly applied to that. Weirdly, it appears that widows were kind of immune to this accusation. So if you're a widow, you could presumably be grumpy. Courts don't seem to have punished widows in the same way as married women. Who knows why? The courts talk about what this grumpy behaviour might be, and some of the things are remarkably mild by our standards. The courts record some of the terms used by these scolds to accuse other people of being a wretched knave or a lying blatherer. These were sufficient to get you fined and up in front of the magistrate. Seems fairly tame by today's standards, but obviously it was sufficient to get you in trouble in the medieval period. Here's a word you might like, noctavigation. It's a word you don't hear used very much, but it was a crime in the medieval period. And it was the crime of wandering about aimlessly and without good reason at night. I think it boils down to the suspicion that you were up to no good if you were out about. There weren't specific curfews as such, but it was generally frowned upon to be sort of wandering around after dark. I think because people thought you'd be loitering and getting up to no good, listening to what other people are saying and all that kind of stuff. So it was a sort of social crime. It was punished by a fine, and it doesn't seem to have been particularly widespread, but I just think it's really nice that we have a specific word for hanging about suspiciously at night. Medieval coins were valued because of the metal inherent in them, so the silver or the gold or whatever it might be. That was the value of the coin. It was linked to the bullion price. Unlike today, where coins are not really worth anything other than what it says on the front. It's a different thing. In the medieval period, a piece of gold had to weigh a certain amount and a certain purity, and it had its value. If you could shave little bits off the edges, called coin clipping, you could slowly build up a pile of bullion, melt it down and sell it, and theoretically get away with a coin that was slightly lighter. If you did it to enough coins and a few people noticed, get away with it. Now, medieval merchants were onto this, and what they did is they weighed the coins. They were actually, especially if they're dealing with international affairs, international trade, they would literally weigh the coins because they were concerned about the amount of gold or silver that they were getting, not the nominal face value of the thing itself. So they were very aware of that. And of course, debasing coins, which is what coin clipping is all about, was treated in exactly the same way as counterfeiting. Basically, it was punishable by death because it would undermine the very fabric of trade and commerce. In fact, Henry VIII debased his coinage to such an extent that it took generations for the reputation of English coins to improve just after the medieval period. In 1281, the sumptuary laws were instigated. These were really designed to control what people wore. They were supposed to maintain society and to avoid people pretending being what they weren't, but they were widely ignored as far as we can tell, and the fines were not particularly severe, and not many people really got prosecuted. There were some interesting twists on the sumptuary laws, though. Sex workers, prostitutes in the medieval period, technically it wasn't illegal to be a prostitute, but it was frowned upon, it was considered immoral. However, bishops ran brothels, in particular on Southwark, so south of the river in London. There's very famous a whole area there that was considered to be of ill repute. It's mentioned by Chaucer. The Southwark geese were actually controlled by a bishop, made money from rent and all sorts of stuff. Now, those prostitutes were not allowed by this law to wear fur in their hoods to avoid them being mistaken for decent women. That's what it literally says in the statute. The idea was to mark them out as professionals, sex workers. They were also required to wear a specific type of garment, a hood. And this hood was either a particular colour or it was a particular stripy cloth. The cloth itself was heavily taxed, so this is a way for the authorities to make money from prostitutes, which they frowned upon, but they could charge them extra for the cloth that they were required to wear to identify themselves as sex workers. The taxman always finds a way. You could be fined for wearing an illegal jacket. In 1463, there was a statute issued which forbade men from wearing jackets so scandalously short that it was showing their genitals and buttocks. In these days, people often have split hose, which meant that if your jacket or your tunic wasn't long enough, the hose would just come up to your top of your thighs and be fastened to a belt. And you'd have a pair of baggy linen underpants called brays on underneath, and your jacket would then cover that. It appears that enough young, full of energy people were having their jackets scandalously short and were exposing their genitals to people as they walked through the streets. So a law was enacted, and you could be fined 20 shillings, which is about 700 to £1,000. So it's a fairly substantial fine for this kind of lewd display. I imagine it still went on. So people wearing ridiculously short trousers or baggy things or whatever it might be is very medieval. Shoes in the late 15th century became ridiculous, quite frankly. They had such long points that sometimes it was very difficult to walk unless you had the points tied back up to your kneecap. And sometimes from illustrations it appears these, what are called krakauers or pikes, were so ridiculous that they had bells on them, they were tied with silken cloth to the knees. Basically, a law was brought in to try to control this, and it specifically says that no knight under a certain level of nobility shall have shoes with a point of more than 2 inches or be fined. The fine was, 2 shillings, about 70, £100, something of that order. So it wasn't a big fine, but I find it fascinating that fashion got so ridiculous that the authorities decided they needed a rule to control it. What's equally interesting is that if you were really high up and a lord, the rules didn't apply, so you could have the most ridiculously long clown-pointed shoes and you could get away with it. In 1318, it was declared illegal to play football in London. Yep, you're not supposed to play footy in London. The same law was rolled out across the whole of England in 1388, so you were just basically not meant to play football. This was designed to force people to do archery more, because obviously that was useful as a backup for the army. Longbows were very powerful at the time, and the authorities thought that they needed more longbow men, so you need to practice. So footy was banned. It was also designed to control what labourers and common people did with their spare time. You notice the theme in a lot of these laws is about social control. However, it seems that it was sort of widely ignored, and even Henry VIII, when technically it was illegal to play football, Henry VIII actually owned a pair of footy boots. So I guess if the king does it, then ordinary people can as well. Medieval football was very different to modern football, though. It was more of an organised brawl, a very, very physically demanding sport, and a bit like a massive fight between groups of men, young men, with a lot of drinking, a lot of gambling. Similar to tennis. Now, tennis was banned for ordinary people, completely banned for ordinary people to play. You weren't allowed to play it, apart from Christmas Day. If you were an ordinary person, a commoner, you could play tennis on Christmas Day. Why? I don't know, but that's what the law says. This was specifically to control the debauchery, the gambling and the drunkenness that was associated with tennis. Some people might say that's much the same as today. In medieval times, you were not allowed to steal a whale. Whales in general, not the country, but the actual beast itself. So if a whale washed up, or you caught a whale in territorial waters, that was technically owned by the monarch, the king usually. These were called royal fish, despite a whale clearly not being a fish. I suppose for the medieval person it was a thing with a that goes through the ocean. Sturgeon and whales were declared royal fish, so all of them were owned by the monarch. This is in part because whale washing up on the shore was incredibly valuable. There's a lot of natural resources, a lot of fat, a lot of meat, a lot of whale bone, and these were all used in industrial processes. So the carcass itself would have been a huge windfall for a medieval town or village. I'm pretty sure that quite a lot of them weren't mentioned to the royal crown itself, because how do you get a message out there and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, technically it was a requirement to notify. Still is a requirement. So when you see the news reports of a beached whale, anything over 25 foot long, technically you're supposed to write a letter or send an email to the Crown and say, I've got one of your whales, what do you want to do about it? I think the Crown these days just sort of sends that off to the local authorities and they tidy it all up. But technically it's still owned by the Crown. I think what's kind of interesting from my research into sort of these odd medieval laws is they're about societal control, about the authorities trying to keep peasants and nobles can do what they like, and if you're in between, you've got to be careful about the clothes you wear and what you do and how you're seen. It seems to be a society, especially the later medieval, struggling with changes. Nobody ever woke up one day and said, I'm not medieval anymore. There was obviously a transition into the Renaissance and beyond. And I think some of these laws, particularly sumptuary laws, come in because people were consuming and expressing themselves differently, and the old guard, as always the old guard, didn't want it to change, so they put laws in place, but quite frankly nobody really bothered with them, and they were widely ignored. There was one that was interesting that was even more widely ignored than all the others. Back in around the 12th, 13th century, there was a law enacted for everybody, from king all the way down. Supposedly, I suppose the king was not controlled by the laws at that period. Maybe they were a bit. It was Magna Carta 1215, but it said you're not supposed to have more than 2 courses in a meal, except for at Christmas when you're allowed 3, which is very generous of the authorities, isn't it? This is designed to control the excessive consumption of various kinds of meats. This is sort of a gluttony law, an anti-gluttony law. Again, completely and obviously ignored by pretty much everybody. But who's going to shop you? You know, if you have 3 meals in your dinner, who's going to report you to the authorities, and how do you get any proof and all that kind of stuff? So it was designed really to signal that you should be more modest with your consumption of food. Didn't work, didn't change anything. And I think it's interesting that the medieval society, especially in the later medieval period, was transitioning towards the Renaissance and towards the next phase. And I sometimes think the medieval period should finish before the 15th century, around the sort of 1400s instead of 1485, because so many things had come on from there. So you had guns on the battlefield, and you had society was changing, becoming more urban. There was a great urbanisation of war, trade was happening, and I sometimes feel like there's a very grey area between what's medieval and what's not. And even then, you go into the Renaissance, and nobody ever woke up and went, we're not in the medieval period anymore, we're in the Renaissance. For most people, it would have been a slow transition over their lifetime. There are more absurd laws, but I thought those were the best ones. Please like and subscribe if you are minded to do so. I don't ask very often, but occasionally I do. Spread the word, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Were medieval peasants slaves, and was medieval serfdom effectively the same as slavery? The population of medieval England is actually quite hard to estimate. The Domesday Book, that fantastic document written by our Norman conquerors, Duke William of Normandy in 1086, catalogued a huge amount of the country in a vast amount of detail. But it actually only mentions about 283,000 people, and it misses out some very big categories: women, children, the clergy. It doesn't talk about London in particular, and it misses out some parts of England as well, because it wasn't fully completed. So of that 283,000 men that are mentioned in the Domesday Book, we projected up to be something of the order of 2 million, 2.5 million people living in England in the medieval time. In the 11th century, most of the population lived in villages, in rural communities. And by most of the population, I mean estimates vary between 90 to 95% of the population, leaving 5% of the population to live in the growing towns and cities. London was quite big, but by comparison to today, absolutely minuscule. What that means then is that the vast majority of the medieval population were peasants. Typically, peasants were divided into two broad categories. They were serfs or servile, or they were freemen or free. Well, what's the difference between a serf and a slave? Well, actually, quite a lot. A serf could be bought and sold, but as part of a piece of land. So the lord of the manor could buy and sell a parcel of land that would have you attached to it. But you had certain rights to that land, to farm and live there. And those couldn't be removed by the lord of the manor, which is a kind of form of buying and selling tenancies. Landlords today will buy a tenement building with a lot of people that have rights, that are living in it, and they get the rent. Same thing, really. So arguably, nothing much has changed there. Slaves, on the other hand, could be bought and sold as individual human beings for money, with no reference to a piece of land, nothing at all. Now, interestingly, in the Norman period, slavery seems to have been massively in decline. In fact, various bishops preached against it, and Bishop Anselm said in particular, it should be wrong to sell a man like a brute beast. So it appears that the Normans made significant efforts to actually destroy the trade in slavery that happened in the earlier medieval period. There was a slave trade between Bristol and Dublin. Dublin was actually set up by the Vikings specifically as a slave trading port. And Bristol, which became famous for the slave trade later on in history, was also partly responsible for dispatching slaves to various parts of the world back then in the medieval period. There were slaves mentioned in the Domesday Book. These are Englishmen whose social status is slave, but they're few and far between. The vast majority of farm workers are peasants, and they have rights. So it appears that the whole concept of slavery was dispatched and got rid of by the Normans. Admittedly, it was commuted to bonded servitude, if you like. Basically, it was Norman policy to free slaves, turn them into bonded servants, people who actually had to work the land for themselves, but give them rights. It's really fascinating to think that the Norman conquest brought with it one of the first emancipations of slaves in the Western world. A lord was not allowed to kill or maim his serf. He would get into trouble for that, but he was allowed to tax him in lots of different ways. So, for example, when a serf died, the lord got to choose his best animal as a death duty. We still have death duties today in much of the Western world. He could tax him if he wanted to get married and perhaps partly control who he married and where he was going to live afterwards. And one of the ways that was particularly contentious was he could force him to use the lord's mill to mill his grain. Now, it's perfectly possible if you're a peasant to mill grain at home, but the lord could force you to mill the grain at his miller's mill, and the miller would often be a bit corrupt, would charge you 10%, and it would also charge you much more money than it would have cost you to do it yourself. So milling grain at the lord's mill was a source of revenue for the lord, but it was also a source of severe discontent amongst the peasantry. We do have a record of a lord being fined for thrashing. We don't know what thrashing means, but he was fined for thrashing his serf. He was fined 40 shillings, which is actually quite a large sum of money. Now, money's value is actually quite hard to determine by today's standards, but people were paid a penny or so for a day's work. So therefore, a shilling is many, many days' work. It's probably the equivalent to tens of thousands of pounds or dollars in today's currencies. Magna Carta, the Great Charter, specifically says that a lord is not allowed to bring a villain to ruin. So he's specifically not allowed to confiscate his land or the tools of his trade, which is interesting because that's very similar to modern day Western bankruptcy laws. You can take a lot of goods, you can't take, usually, the tools of somebody's trade. The typical medieval peasant lived as part of a manor, and that manor would compose of 2 or 3 villages. They'd live there with their family on effectively their small holding, and they'd report to one lord. So one lord would have 2 or 3 villages to his name. That would obviously change. Some had fewer, some had many, many more. And if you were servile, you had to work 2 or 3 days a week for the lord of the manor on boon work. If you were free, you usually had to pay rent in terms of money, but sometimes you could do physical work for the lord. Of course, not everybody lived in the manorial system. There are big religious communities, and those are worked by people called lay brothers, who are not specifically clergy, but they were the ones doing all the physical labour in the religious institution. There's a theoretical diagonal line that runs very roughly from northwest to southeast that divides England. The upper right bit was the Danelaw and was settled by waves of immigrants from northern Europe, who were then called Danes, who were likely various different people. They had their own laws and customs, just to confuse things. In the area known as Danelaw, there are actually relatively few serfs recorded in the Domesday Book, which is interesting. They're mostly free men, they mostly pay rent, and in some areas, particularly in Northumberland, for example, in the very north of England, there was a curious thing about thanes and drengs, and they actually paid tax based on the number of horned beasts they kept, which is a complete hangover from the very earliest days of the medieval period. In the far south, in Kent, Edward Longshanks, Edward I, Malleus Scotorum, the hammer of the Scots, specifically declared all Kentishmen be free. So there's a totally different organisation in the south of England and in the north of England, just to confuse things. We do have records of some of the highly detailed jobs that the medieval peasant was expected to do. The Black Book of Peterborough, which was made between 1125 and 1128, specifies each man must plough 4 acres for the spring sowing, must work 3 days in each week, and must supply 60 hens and 640 eggs a year. Very specific. The Knights Templar, yes, real Knights Templars did exist, and they ran religious institutions in medieval England. I'm not sure whether they were hiding the Holy Grail or having all these sort of legendary adventures that later stories were to embellish, but they genuinely did exist, and they genuinely wrote down rules for what people had to do on their land and when. There are specific phrases like, must mow 4 days a week until the meadows are cleared and the hay is carried in. It was also specified that they would have to carry loads to Gloucester, which was 20 miles away from the religious establishment, or wherever the master wills it. And they also needed to move the sheepfold twice a year. So the rules were written down in very, very specific detail, and woe betide anybody that didn't actually follow them. Now, of particular interest, I think, is that as the medieval period goes on, a lot of the religious orders started to change the willingness to accept cash. And I think this is really because money is a bit more reusable than 4 days a week mowing and so. The actual cash could then be transported and moved abroad or moved to different parts of the world where it was specifically needed. Whereas having a bunch of blokes who have to specifically mow this specific field at this time of year is not as flexible as give me the money and I can do what I like with it. So as the medieval period goes on, we see a lot of transition from boon work, having to do certain things at certain times of the year, to paying money instead, even if you're servile. Here's another interesting little nugget in the records. We see some families that start out as free become servile. So it's possible to go the other way, and some people who started out servile become free. And it does appear that certain land came with servility. So it was possible, in some cases, to get more and better land if you were servile and sort of go down the social ladder, if you like, but have more land and better land and give up your freedom, and vice versa. So the situation, as always, is actually quite a lot more complex. We know that some people went to court to prove that they were servile or free, and often they were talking about whether their father was servile or free or not. And in some cases, the whole situation is muddied because free men married servile women and servile men married free women. And the courts had to determine what happens to that union, to that family group. Were they now servile or were they now free? As you can imagine, with human beings, the situation is quite complicated. But just like today, status matters for some people, but not everybody. From the 10th century to the 12th century, the courts seem very keen to determine who is a serf or is servile and who's actually free. So how do you prove that you're free? Or how does your lord of the manor prove that you're servile? Well, one of the definitions is terra ad furcum et flagellum, which is Latin for do you hold by fork and flail, which we think, and we're not sure, we think this means do you hold the land because of tasks you have to do for the lord of the manor, or do you actually pay him rent? Because the idea is if you broadly have to do work for the lord of the manor, you are servile, and if you pay money rent, then you're free. But of course, in life, it is never that simple, because most of the records indicate that people had a bit of both. They paid some money and they did some tasks. So the courts had to work out how servile or how free you might or might not be. Then, of course, as now, going to court was expensive. So it must have been a really important thing for people to have decided for them, or they must have wanted to prove that they were free as opposed to servile. I don't quite know why. Maybe it was a social thing. Maybe it was just a personal, I am free and I want to prove it and have the courts prove it. Maybe lords of the manor didn't want too many free people on their land. And maybe because you had a broadly less literate society, people didn't have the paperwork to prove what their status was. So forks and flails are important deciders as far as the court is concerned. If you are a villain, a serf, you're servile, how do you win your freedom? Well, there are several ways that can happen, actually. The first one, and you might have guessed, you pay money to your lord in what's called quit rent. You pay him money and he declares you free. Now, technically, all the money you owed had to be paid by a third person, because as a serf, you didn't actually own any of your own money, technically, although it's a bit more complex than that. Basically, you had to get a third person to pay the money to your lord. But the lord was probably quite happy to receive the money, declared you free. Sometimes there'd be a big ceremony associated with it, and we have records of the mayor of the town celebrating your freedom. So it was a big social event in some cases, and who knows why people wanted to become free. Maybe it was just a social status, maybe it saved them taxes, we don't really know. But that's the main way people became free. There's another one. If you didn't have any money, you could run away. Yes, you could actually run away to the town. There's an expression in medieval England which is town air sets men free. And that's exactly what you had to do. You had to run away, live in the town undetected for a year and a day. Now, lords of the manor were often not very keen for this to happen, so they would send people in to capture you. But But the towns were actually expanding rapidly at this time in history. They were quite keen to make sure you became free, because then you become a townsman and you would add to their power. So the towns usually turned either a blind eye to you being a runaway serf, or slightly helped you, kind of gave you nudges in the right direction, or certainly wouldn't have turned you in, because it's to their advantage if you become free. Thirdly, you take holy orders, because if you are a member of the clergy, you are exempt from ordinary rules. You have to follow church rules, and you would be tried in church courts, for example. And often the churches didn't have the death penalty. They sent you to some far-away monastery to live the rest of your life if you're particularly bad. But basically, the clergy were outside the serf-free kind of spectrum, if you like. So you could become a man of the cloth, follow God, and become free that way. And lastly, it is possible, but it's not really recorded very much in medieval manuscripts, but it is possible that good military service might have enabled you to win your freedom, if you like. And some of the evidence we have from that is William Shakespeare, post-medieval, but quite close to the medieval period. In Henry V, he says, "He who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, be he ne'er so vile," i.e. he's a villain, he's servile. "Today shall gentle his condition. Today he shall become free." So in that statement, Henry V is specifically saying to the villains or the servile people in his army that if you fight for me, you shed your blood, and we win, I will give you your freedom. You'll become a free man. Whether that happened in history or not, we don't actually know, but I think it's quite likely. So if you fought for your country and did so well, there's a fair chance, if you did it well enough, you might become free. But it is an interesting representation of what Shakespeare, who was closer to the medieval period, thought might be the case. He could be making it up, but I think it's quite likely that if you gave good military service and you were a villain, why wouldn't your lords and masters make you free? What's the difference between a tavern, an inn, and an alehouse in the medieval period? Or are they the same thing? Taverns, inns and alehouses are three establishments where alcohol was served. But what's the difference? Well, taverns were introduced by the Romans. It comes from the Latin taverna, which is an inn. But it has a bit of a specialist sort of connotation. Taverns in the medieval period were where you could drink wine, and they were considered to be a little more upmarket than your average drinking establishment, although they varied, as you can imagine. There were really upmarket taverns and really quite down and dirty taverns, of course. Now, wine in the medieval period is any alcoholic beverage which is brewed from fruit. So obviously the fruit of the grape, that's what we know as wine, and most of the wine in this country that was imported was red, but English wine did exist. So the fruit of the grape, but also technically cider and perry. Cider being from apples, perry being from pears, were incredibly popular and were considered to be wines because it's a fruit. We don't really think of them as wines anymore. Although people today do make elderberry wine, which I always thought was a bit strange, but of course elderberry is a fruit, and therefore if you make wine from it, then that's what it actually is. It's literally a wine. So wine was broadly served in taverns, and possibly light meals, but other forms of entertainment as well, but possibly not the lower end of entertainment that might be expected in other places. So they did consider themselves a cut above the other places. In the medieval period, London had a population of about 80,000 people. and there were over 350 taverns within the city walls, which means there was a tavern for every roughly 250 people. It's quite a lot of taverns, actually, if you can imagine that. Now, each tavern was run by a vintner, a purveyor of wines, and often those vintners would be wholesale wine salesmen as well. They would keep a cellar, that wine would be sold on and off the premises, and there was a guild of vintners, and the Guild of Vintners still exists today in London, has been continuously there for hundreds of years since the medieval period. The guilds tried to maintain a monopoly on the trade, but also they tried to maintain quality, and you could be thrown out of the guild if you were serving bad wine. And one of the interesting laws about taverns was that during opening hours, the vintner was supposed to keep the cellar unlocked and was supposed to allow a client to go and visit the cellar to see exactly what kind of wine was being served. They could actually go and check the markings on the barrel and check that it was from the place it was supposed to be. And vintners that served bad wine, or wine that was gone sour, or wine that was actually adulterated with water perhaps, were punished by going into the stocks, and sometimes the remains of what they were selling, their bad wine, was tipped all over their heads. So occasionally you might see a vintner covered in wine sitting in the stocks. Well, that means he's a bad person. Probably be thrown out of the guild as well and lose his job. So the rules around owning a tavern were fairly strict. I'm sure they weren't always followed though, of course, otherwise the laws wouldn't be needed. Now, the most expensive wine was called Rhenish wine, which comes from the Germanic areas. That was imported a long way. That was supposedly quite sweet, and the value of wine in the medieval period really depended on its sweetness. So the sweeter the wine, the more expensive it would be. A lot of the wines came from Gascony in northern France, and those were roughly 4 times as expensive as an equivalent amount of ale. And they were sold by the cup. So wine was available if you had a reasonable amount of money. It wasn't particularly expensive, but it was a lot more expensive than ale. And typically ale was drunk by the working classes as well as the tradesmen. There was a type of wine grown in England as well, which is typically white wine, which is interesting. But a lot of that didn't really get sold in the taverns as such, because it was often grown by the clergy and grown by the nobility and consumed on their own premises. So they grew their own wine effectively, which is kind of interesting. And today there's a little bit of English wine grown in the southern parts of England. 2 other drinks which I haven't mentioned yet are mead and metheglin. Mead is honey, is fermented honey. Metheglin is fermented honey and fruit juice as well, combined. Now, those appear to have been available at taverns, but were not particularly popular, as far as I can tell. They seem to have been reserved for special events. They seem to be those sort of drinks that you would drink at a feast or at a wedding. And of course, weddings give us the term honeymoon, where the couple would often drink a lot of honey, a lot of mead for a month after their wedding. And I guess that was a form of luxury that wouldn't be available to them later. And also, you had cider and perry available in the west of England quite a lot. And in the west of England, there seems to be so much of that it was roughly half the price of ale. So cider and perry were stronger in alcohol, but also half the price. It's certainly a lot cheaper than wine.
Order filled. Order submitted.
Inns are really associated with travellers. The idea of an inn was that it's a place to sleep overnight, a place to rest, to get some food, stable your horse if you've got a horse, look after your mule if you've got a mule, your pack ponies, whatever it might be. They could be safe and looked after. And you could get a little bit of R&R, you could get a bed for the night, might be in a communal bed, by the way. People slept sometimes 12 to a bed, or you might just get a corner, or if you're really cheap, you might be sleeping in the stables. But it was somewhere associated with, it was a little bit organised, a little bit safe. You could meet fellow travellers, you could sort of recharge, and then you go on your way again. Lots of inns were based at the gates to big cities or towns. They're a place that's convenient. So if you're a traveller, well, you get to the place you're going to and you think, I'm really knackered, I need to have a rest. So the closest place is the gate, and therefore you go to the easiest inn you can find, and that was the one that you saw when you first got to the place you're going to. Other sorts of inns were placed at convenient distances from one place to another, roughly a day's comfortable travel, and maybe not a day's ride exactly, but 3/4 of a day's ride, maybe a whole day's walk. Sometimes at crossroads, but on major roads. And you'll see these in England as well. There's one in particular that I remember passing. It's close to the Fosse Way, and it's in the middle of nowhere really, except if you look at it on a map, it's about 20 miles from one town and 20 miles to the other. In the middle of nowhere, but a good place for everybody to stop. So it was good for business because everybody was going to stop there basically. So they were melting pots for all sorts of types of people. You would also have people from all walks of life. So there were a variety of different qualities of accommodation often available. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer talks about little more than a journey from one inn all the way through various other inns to the eventual Canterbury. And it starts at an inn called the Tabard Inn. Now, tabard is associated with a type of clothing used to go over armour, often had heraldry on it, so it's a very knightly thing. It was south of the river in a place called Southwark. Now, Southwark back then was fairly notorious. It was notorious because it was out of the bounds of the city walls. It was out of the bounds of the city laws as well. So you could just cross the river, you'd get to Southwark, and it was notorious for bear baiting, cockfighting, prostitution, gambling, all sorts of nefarious activities, which is presumably why Chaucer started his journey there, emphasising perhaps the lack of religious seriousness of these pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. You might not realise, but the Tabard Inn still exists. You can actually go and have a pint there to this day. Alehouses were little more than somebody's accommodation, somebody's house, open to the public, hence public house, which is what we use in Britain to this day to describe pubs. Public house, that's what it means. Really, what that amounted to was a woman, it was usually a woman of the household, brewing sufficient beer for more than her family. So she had excess, and it was an easy way to make some money. They brewed ale, not beer at this stage, but ale, which is barley, malted barley, sometimes oats. Take the juice from that and you ferment it. Sometimes you can add spices if you want to change the flavour, but broadly speaking you don't. It's fairly sweet compared to modern beer, and it has a very high nutritional value, so people effectively use this as liquid bread. It was a very important component of the peasant diet, of the ordinary person's diet. And remember, at this stage in history in medieval England, 95% of the population were peasants. They were farmers, subsistence plus farmers. In times of plenty, they could sell excess food, but sometimes they went a little bit without. But alehouses, and sometimes there were quite a lot of these, there were villages and towns rather than cities as such, run by women, and people would go in there, drink the ale until it ran out. Ale doesn't keep for very long either, so you have to really encourage people to drink the whole brew today, maybe tomorrow. Third, fourth day, probably it's starting to go sour. There's some suggestion that some of the spices and herbs that could be added could extend the life. And hops, the bittering agent that makes beer from ale, effectively, that bittering agent really didn't start to be used extensively until the very end of the Middle Ages. It was really a Renaissance drink. Beer's a Renaissance drink and ale is a medieval drink. It was used a little bit. It was introduced and it caused a little bit of controversy because this sort of newfangled bitter drink was considered to be a bit foreign, and so some people thought it was a bit dodgy. But it became very popular very quickly, and hops have the effect of lengthening the life of the beer. It makes it last longer in the vat. So you could make a brew and it would be drinkable for a couple of weeks, possibly only a week, depends on the temperature. At this time period, it's unlikely that ale was sold in sort of regulated volumes. The wholesale price was regulated. Magna Carta talks about a London quarter being the unit of selling of wholesale ale, but the individual person probably just brought their own cup, probably their own pots. They talk about having pots of beer or mazers. Mazers are bowls, not really flagons in the way you might imagine from a later period. Some kind of drinking vessel, but I guess you tried to have the biggest drinking vessel possible. I don't know whether you got charged more if you had a particularly big drinking vessel. We just don't know about that. I haven't seen any evidence whatsoever. How do you advertise the fact that you've got a brew on if it's just a public house? Well, the answer is you put a branch or a broom outside, something to indicate that there is a brew on that everybody in the local area would know. It's like, oh, Mrs. Miggins has got a brew on, right, we'll go round there and we'll have a bit of a booze up and a bit of a party. Not really a party, I suppose, but a bit of a social event. And she's very good at brewing beer, so her beer's excellent. The price of beer was controlled by statute law. So it was 1 penny for 4 gallons of beer. Now that does slightly vary if the price of barley changes a bit, but broadly speaking, it was 1 penny for 4 gallons. That gives you an idea. The ale wasn't that strong necessarily. It's probably a bit more like light beer today. So 2%, 3%, not really compared to the strong ciders, certainly not as strong as wine of the period. So it could be drunk without too much inebriation. Although, as the coroner's reports attest, people did get absolutely plastered and sometimes kill themselves as a result of falling over. The alehouses started to become a bit more professional, and the sign outside started to get more gaudy. So in an environment where people weren't necessarily very strong readers, illiteracy is another topic, but people could read but not very well. What you needed is a way of saying,
Order filled.
the house
Order submitted.
4 doors down with the red door has got a good ale on, go there and have a drink. What they started to do is put painted signs outside. So rather than saying the house 4 doors down with a red door, you would say the house with a painted sign of a red lion outside it. Go to the Red Lion. Everybody would know where it was. Go to the Prince's Arms. Go to the King's Head. These are all recognisable symbols, often of the medieval period, if you look into it.
Submitted.
And they helped identify the location of the alehouse, which I think is fascinating. Now, sometimes these signs got a bit awkward. They stuck out too far into the road and they caused a nuisance. So from the period, we have rules about how big these signs were allowed to be and how heavy they could be as well, because obviously if they fell down and fell onto people, that would be an issue. So they couldn't be over a certain set size, which is really interesting. It shows you that people were probably breaking those rules and having massive signs outside to say, come and get your ale here. Very useful source of extra income for the woman of the household too. You may have noticed I've not spoken about spirits very much in terms of drinking, and that's because they weren't widely drunk at all. In fact, they really weren't known particularly as a drink in the medieval period. Distillation of perfumes and oils was known about since antiquity, and it was also known about in the medieval period. We have a record of 13th century Italy of people distilling alcohol from wine and producing a very strong substance, but it wasn't used to drink. It was specifically used to treat smallpox, so it was considered to be a medicine as opposed to a drink. Now, we do, in the end of the medieval period, start to hear stories of people dying tragically through drinking too much of what they called aqua vitae, this is the water of life. This was distilled alcohol. But right at the very end of it, and it appears that drinking it was fairly unusual. It certainly wasn't served in taverns, inns and alehouses at all. And everybody thought of it as a medicine rather than a type of drink. Whiskey, being distilled from beer, doesn't really appear until after the medieval period. And distilled drinks in general are post-medieval. In fact, in the 17th century, gin was so cheap that it caused a lot of societal problems. It was sold to people in pints, so imagine drinking a pint of gin and what that does to you. Well, it was a big problem, actually, and they had to bring in quite a lot of laws for that. Did medieval people drink to excess? Yes, of course they did. Just as today, some people drink too much of whatever it is their favourite booze might be. And the coroner's records, which we have, show an extensive number of deaths by accidents, a number of cases. One in particular, a gentleman was pissing in the local pond and overbalanced, fell in and drowned. Another one, was going home after visiting the ale house with a pot of ale. So that's interesting. That's sort of off-market, taking the booze back home with you. So there's a little bit of evidence. But he was taking a pot of ale home with him when he was bitten by a dog. He stooped to try and pick up a stone and throw it at that dog, whereupon he tumbled over and smashed his head open on a wall. It's pretty bad. And one unfortunate chap was going home after drinking far too much in the local alehouse and fell in the town well and drowned. Really unpleasant deaths, I suppose, but people fall over when they're drunk. They did back then, they're still doing it today. What happens when you're at the end of a long journey? There's an inn ahead and you want to stop for the night, and maybe you're on an animal like this. Let me explain what I think happens. The medieval inn was a really important location, especially because towards the end of the medieval period, a lot of relatively wealthy merchants were travelling for commerce. There was an expansion in the wool and cloth trade, and people needed to get goods from one place to the other. Now, without a very sophisticated infrastructure, those goods travelled at the speed of foot or hoof, more likely, and therefore people needed places to stay on their journeys, and that led to the massive growth and expansion of the inn trade. Typically, a small town might contain one inn, a market town, a bit more prosperous, a bit more busy, might contain 2 or 3, and a provincial capital, 10, 15 inns. So it shows you how important they were. They were also social centres as well for those places. On arrival at an inn, you'd probably be met by open gates leading onto a central courtyard. Those gates are usually left open during the day, locked at dusk or when the curfew happens, and you'd be met by a servant or porter, as they were sometimes called. That porter would ask your business. You would say, I want to stay the night and I've got 3 pack ponies, and they would say whether there was space or not and what the fee was. And of course, that fee, you would think there would be a lot of haggling. It appears that the fees for staying in inns were fixed by the guilds or by law. There wasn't really haggling for, save money to reduce the price. I imagine prices did change a little bit perhaps, but maybe not. The medieval period is filled with prices that are fixed, so everybody knew what they had to pay for certain things. Your pack ponies, your mules, whatever it might be, would be led away to the stables. You might be asked what they want to eat, and they'd presumably be watered and fed hay. And if you wanted to give them a hard feed, like horse bread or something like that, then you'd possibly pay extra. And basically, they'd have a place that would be secure, and your goods would be placed somewhere secure as well. And then you would go off, perhaps, to meet the innkeeper or to go to the common room and have a well-earned beer or drink of some sort. A place to stay when you're travelling was, of course, not a medieval invention at all. Inns have been part of travel infrastructure since antiquity. Ancient Persia and ancient Rome had very sophisticated places to stay for travellers, and those were typically run kind of almost on an imperial basis. They were run not exactly by the state, but by the system. The system needed that kind of infrastructure to enable it. The medieval inns tended to be a little bit more random and private. They sprung up in places that were important to have an inn, important for a place to stay, and so were a bit more chaotic. Now, the Roman inns typically were based largely on the villa structure, which was an interior courtyard and rooms around the outside, and that was just duplicated in the inns, the medieval inns. And it's quite useful. It serves a purpose. It means you're going through a threshold, you're somewhere a little bit safe. Depending on how the structure is built, it could be slightly defensive if the windows on the ground floor only open up inside into the courtyard. The gate can be shut at night, and probably was shut at night, because let's face it, you don't want too many people coming in after dark. They're usually miscreants and the dodgy types. But it also serves the purpose of not letting people leave if they haven't paid their bills. So those gates effectively locked the clientele in to make sure that bills were settled, or at least some kind of structure was made for payment for people. Because let's face it, in the medieval period, if you could get away on a fast horse, you could get away ahead of the data, ahead of the news, because the news travelled at the speed of a galloping horse or a trotting or cantering horse, to be honest. And people might not be able to recognise you as well. So there were fewer people around, so strangers were perhaps more recognised, but at the same time, there was no data infrastructure to pass the word on that somebody had absconded but not paid their bill. So I think there's a little bit of that as well. And also people felt safer if they were sleeping in a more secure type of accommodation. Medieval inns, by their very nature, were melting pots for people who had been travelling from one place to another. And when people met, they talked. And when they talked, they spread news, they spread gossip. And of course, that was a major source of information for local people. Travelling people brought news of what was going on, and the news only travelled at the speed of the people spreading it. So they were important places for exchange of information, and a lot of trade was done as well at your local inn. You'd meet interesting people, rumours would be spread, but also social uprising and discussions would be had with travellers just resting, chatting to other people who maybe come from the continent or come from other places and heard things. You might be unsurprised to hear that quite a lot of social uprisings actually kicked off in inns. They were quite notorious as hotbeds of discontent and rabble-rousing. And in fact, some of the biggest social uprisings actually started in various types of inn. Medieval inns were owned in different ways. It might be the local innkeeper actually physically owned it. It was a private institution. They might be owned by the local lord of the manor. They might be owned by the local abbey. They could be owned by guilds. There's all sorts of different ownership structures. But what we do know is they were very wealthy, good money-making institutions. So people wanted to own an inn, if they possibly could, in a good location. Inns were, of course, run by the innkeeper, but there were an awful lot of other staff involved as well. So depending on the scale of the inn and the busyness of it, there would be a whole bunch of different numbers of people doing all sorts of different tasks. Some innkeepers paid rent, others kept the money themselves. Compared to most local businesses, inns were the big thing. They were the wealthiest place, and they could earn a reasonable time between £5 and £10 a year. That was significantly more than most other businesses in the local area. As a result, the innkeeper was often a very, very important member of the local society. In fact, we have records of how successful some of them actually were. Richard Kingsmill was a town constable, a local magistrate, town bailiff, and also became a member of Parliament as a result of, I guess, the money he earned through being an innkeeper. He was also a trader in all sorts of goods like fish and cloth and wine, and he is recorded as having a flock of over 200 sheep. Were there any women innkeepers? Yes, there were. The records say that about 20% of innkeepers in the medieval period were female. Inns, of course, came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The smaller ones had a smaller group of people looking after them and a smaller number of clientele and a smaller turnover, obviously. Very busy ones actually had a very significant team of people doing very specialist jobs. So, for example, there was the innkeeper, but there were also things like accountancy staff, people that had to kind of maintain the books. You had cleaners and cooks, you had maintenance staff, you had security if you needed it, the porter, as I mentioned before. You might even have horse handlers or mule handlers or donkey handlers, whatever they might be, because all your travellers are going to likely have creatures with them. They're going to have beasts of burden. It's not like cars that can just be parked in a car park. They actually need to be looked after. There's a whole other area there of infrastructure that we don't tend to think of in a motel, for example. So you've got all the creature handlers as well, and you would also need a place to secure valuables and wealthy things, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. But if you imagine you were in a fantasy setting with unusual types of beasts of burden, maybe hippogriffs or unicorns or whatever it is that you're riding on, you're going to need to keep them as well. And in a fantasy setting, I know it's not particularly medieval, but a lot of them are based on the medieval setting, you're going to need to keep those kind of creatures separate. You're going to need specialist handlers for them. You can't mix hippogriffs with horses, because hippogriffs eat horses in the wild. That's going to cause a lot of problems, let alone if somebody's riding a dragon and needs to keep a dragon overnight. So your infrastructure of an inn is going to reflect the needs of its clientele. And if it's medieval, you've got ponies, pack ponies, they don't need much space. They just need a place really to stand out of the wind, possibly not even under shelter, but often under shelter. They don't need a stable as such. They would be kept in what are called standings, which is just enough room for a horse to stand tied up to a ring with a bit of flexibility. It needs its water, it needs its hay, and it'll just stand there and wait and snooze on its 2 feet. Horses don't often lie down when they're in strange places. They'll lie down when they feel relaxed, but often they won't lie down if they're somewhere strange. They'll just snooze standing on all four legs. Same with ponies, same with mules. Don't know about other creatures though. So you had a whole bunch of different people, and you'd have a different structure. Typically you'd have a common room, you'd have a private location for the innkeeper and the innkeeper's family. You'd also perhaps have accommodation for some of the staff. You might need to have a local tavern, a tavern associated with the inn, a tavern as part of the inn as well. Privacy was a bit of a luxury in the medieval period, and so a lot of people would have slept in common rooms. They would have just slept multiple people to a bed, if they even had a bed, or have a corner and a pallet and just sleep there, or actually even in the simplest types of inns, just sleep around the fire where they fell or where they lay down to sleep. Out of the wind, not necessarily particularly warm, but better than sleeping outside. And remember, most people probably wouldn't have removed anything but their outer clothes to sleep. So they'd taken their shoes off and their cloaks and hoods maybe, but then they'd just gone to bed in their clothes really. That's a way to stay warm, no form of central heating. So you pretty much didn't do that. Bathing, there probably wasn't bathing at most inns. That was usually done in a specific location like a bathhouse. Washing facilities would have been available, which would have been a bowl and a jug of water and a cloth really. You'd probably bring your own cloth. Water would be supplied. Wash your hands and your face and other various bits and bobs, but you're not going to sit there having a shower or having a bath, not unless you're in a very wealthy inn and you're going to spend a lot of money on hot water. It's possible, I suppose, but it's extremely unlikely. And I haven't found any records of inns with significant washing facilities. There's obviously an associated bathhouse sometimes in a big town or city, but not sort of shower rooms as such or bathrooms in an inn. There would of course be toilets, and solid waste and liquid waste were collected separately. You would be expected to know that as a traveller. You would do your solid waste into a long drop or over a barrel. That would be collected by gong farmers because that was a valuable resource. And your piss would also be collected in a separate barrel and used for all sorts of different industrial purposes, used for bleaching linen, used for tanning leather, used in all sorts of different industries, and was very valuable. Your piss, once it left your body, didn't actually belong to you anymore. It belonged to whoever was collecting it, whatever guild had the rights to the waste from your body. Something we're not very used to today with the ability to flush everything, but you would be expected to behave that way. Inns had their own storage, of course. They typically had cellars, different types of cellars, much beloved of first-level adventurers going down to the cellar to get rid of the rats, but they genuinely did exist, and those cellars were not really artificially heated or cooled, but by being underground, by being sort of below ground level, they maintained a roughly fridge-like temperature, roughly 5 degrees, which is similar, slightly damp, similar to a modern-day fridge, perhaps, in some ways. So that would typically store root vegetables, wines. Beer probably wasn't stored because it was made and drunk as quickly as possible. Wine was probably stored. You might have cereals and grains stored there as well as some meats hanging and aging on meat hooks for later. Broadly speaking, that was the storage rooms for the inn. If you wanted to look after valuables, gold or gems or whatever it might be, you could use a lockbox. Most inns provided a lockbox. That lockbox would be kept in the living accommodation of the innkeeper. So you would have to do a deal with the innkeeper, fill you in a receipt, and he'd put your gold in his
Order
solid
filled.
lockbox, and that
Order
was kept
submitted.
inside his living accommodation and given back to you after a fee was taken. In the morning, you'd get your goods back. It's also possible that there were live-in entertainers. There were people that were troubadours that would sort of make their money by staying at the inn semi-permanently, or maybe staying a few weeks and then travelling, moving on. And they may stay on site as well. So you might have long-term residents, if you like, of the inn that aren't necessarily servants, they aren't necessarily workers, certainly not the innkeeper or travellers, but just sort of hung around because it was such an important and busy place. You also
Order
might have
cancelled.
people gathering intelligence in the inn as well. So if there were robbers who were going to try and rob wealthy people later on after they've travelled on from the inn, or maybe they would be hanging around trying to listen to see who's got the most money, who's a likely prospect, who's going to be their next victim. So you have to keep your eyes open a little bit on people listening to your conversations, and just be a little bit cautious that those dodgy strangers in a cloak with a hood smoking a pipe in a corner might actually not be up to any good. They might, of course, be heroes of the tale, but often they would not be. And we know in later periods that highwaymen, robbers, used to frequent certain inns, and I'm pretty sure that would have been done with the knowledge of the innkeeper, and the innkeeper probably got cut in to some of the ill-gotten gains. Dick Turpin, for example, used to hang around inns and rob people the next day if he'd established who he was going to rob. So there's some interesting potential threats for medieval travellers there. In the morning, you'd probably get up at around dawn. A lot of medieval things typically really use the daylight, so depending on the time of year, that would vary. But basically, you'd get up at dawn, just before dawn perhaps, pack your things, pay your bill, and head off. Now, you might have met new friends, you might be travelling with them and decide to travel with them to the next destination. You might have met enemies, and they might be following you as well. You might be suspicious, and you might suspect something, and maybe you hire somebody to go along with you. Travelling in groups was something that pilgrims did, and often they actually hired security. They hired Knights Templar to go with them, to protect them. In medieval England, that doesn't get mentioned very much. There were Templars, but they didn't really guard pony trains or anything like that. That was just up to the individual to do. You'd pack up and head off on your journey, and a new set of people would presumably turn up towards the end of that day. So during the day, the inns possibly got quite quiet. There'll be local commerce, there'll be local guilds, perhaps renting a back room for events, but the travellers would typically come in towards the end of the day, towards dusk. They would come in. So the inn would be very busy in the morning, very busy in the evening, possibly not so busy during the middle of the day. Medieval inns must have been very interesting places, potentially slightly dangerous, potentially slightly rough. There would be all sorts of different people from different places crossing paths, exchanging news, gossip, information, trade, doing deals. I think they would have been a kind of nerve centre of the medieval town or city, and therefore a very important place. There is a cliche, of course, in role-playing games. Often things start in a tavern or an inn. I think that's actually quite likely. I think those were the places that people would be seen to hang out. And it wouldn't be unusual to see strangers that you've never seen before and end up talking to them. That's what people did. That's how they exchanged information. So inns in particular were really fascinating nexus points for medieval society. Imagine you've been travelling for a few days, you're low on supplies, you get to the outskirts of a big medieval town or city. You are ravenous. Where do you go and get food cheaply and quickly? Outside of towns and cities, Most people in the medieval period prepared their own food. If you were relatively modest, a peasant, for example, which most of us were, you'd have your own hearth and you'd make food in a skillet or a ceramic or an iron pot. There were things like frying pans and equivalent around, especially later on in the medieval period. And basically, you made the food yourself. If you were rich, you had ovens and you had a kitchen and you had staff, and they would prepare the food for you. But in towns and cities, things started to change. It was about the middle of the medieval period when cookshops started to appear. These were medieval fast food. And what I mean by fast food is food that is ready and waiting for you. It's been cooked, not to order, but it's been cooked to be consumed, but nobody quite knows who's going to buy it yet. You could just go up to the cookshop and buy a pie and consume it there and then. Around the middle of the medieval period, towns and cities were starting to expand quite dramatically. There were a lot more travellers, there was a lot more commerce, there was a lot more going to and from places. So the demand for cookshops started to expand, and where there's a demand, it will be delivered. And those cookshops sprang up in all sorts of places, usually in places that were very busy, so next to a market square or next to a busy gate into a main city, and they would serve the passing clientele. In real towns like Norwich and Bristol, there were actual streets called Cook Street or Cook's Lane, and those were the places where the cookshops mostly were. In the medieval period, types of trade tended to group together. You wanted to go and eat something, or you go to the Cook Street and grab your food. And in Bristol, there was even a guild hall for cooks. So they had their own organisation, like a lot of specialist trades did. I like to think, though, if you were in a fantasy city, the cookshops might be set up to feed adventurers who are coming back from their travels, right next to the gates or in the market square or near adventurers' guilds, perhaps. There would be a set of cookshops delivering food for those specific types of people. I think it's a lovely idea to think that where there's a demand, the supply will be met in a particular stylish way. Most medieval towns were surprisingly crowded, actually, and road frontage was at a premium, especially on things like market squares and important streets, which is where the passing traffic is going to be. In a lot of cases, I think it's likely that the size of a house kind of reflects a certain amount the size of a market stall back in the very early days of that settlement. People kind of ended up with semi-permanent market stalls, and they then went backwards. So a lot of houses are very narrow frontage, but they'd have the main house at the front, they'd have a small narrow courtyard, and then often they'd have their real kitchens at the back in ordinary houses. But in specific cookshops, often when they were built as cookshops, the ovens and the cooking facilities were at the front, because that's where the action was going to take place. And in a lot of places, you don't have glass in the windows. You effectively have a shutter or board that goes up over the gap in the front of the stall, and that is lowered during the day and acts as a table for your wares to be set out. It's literally a display place, and you could prepare food on it, but you could also show what you were selling. And that's really interesting, because at the end of the day, that would be shut up and bolted, because there was no glass in windows. Glass was available in the medieval period, but it was really reserved for churches and rich people. And it's not very secure. You need to be fairly certain of your security if you're going to have a glass window, certainly in the early medieval period and the middle medieval period. One of the other reasons, I think, for medieval houses to be quite narrow, apart from the premium, is they often paid taxes based on road frontage. So the wider your house was, the broader it fronted onto the main thoroughfare, probably the more tax you had to pay. And also, the more road you had to look after, because everybody had an obligation to look after the road directly in front of their building. Didn't always do it, but there was a legal obligation to look after the road in front of you. So what kind of food was actually available in these cookshops? Well, we have a record, a chap called Fitzstephen in the Norman period, so from Norman London, describes what you could get in the cookshops. And he talks about fried, roast and boiled meat of all sorts. He talks about great and small fishes. And he talks about a coarser kind of meat for the poor, We don't actually know what that coarser meat was, of course. I'll leave it to your imagination. Maybe you can put it in the comments. But he literally talks about a coarser kind of meat for the poor. May just have been worse cut, perhaps, or it may have been a particular type of cheap meat. We just don't know. If you wanted bread, you had to get that from the baker, so you could get specific types of food from the cook shop, but if you wanted bread, you had to go to the baker. You couldn't buy bread from the cook shops. You went to the baker. If you wanted ale, you'd go to an ale house. So I imagine scenes where you wanted to have a bit of a meal, you wanted drink, you wanted bread, you wanted a pie. Well, you go to 3 different places and sort of take your snacks with you. I have this vision of the medieval streets filled with people at certain times of the day, choosing what they want to get from which cook shop and deciding, oh, there'll be a nice ale that'll go with this, or I fancy a glass of mead, I better go into this tavern. And so people were carrying food around from one establishment to the other and eating a lot of it on the streets. There weren't such things yet as pavement cafes, as far as I can tell. In the later medieval period, the records talk about all sorts of pies with meat or fish. Not sure about vegetarian pies, but presumably there was some vegetable component in them as well. Vegetarianism wasn't really a thing back in those days. There were people that didn't eat meat, lots of the clergy, for example. But broadly speaking, that was not something that people were particularly familiar with. In London, in the middle of the medieval period, you could get all sorts of things. You could get lots of different types of pies with different fillings. You could get what are called hotcakes. You could get wafers. You could get pasties. You could get cheese flans, and kind of a quiche, I suppose. You could get all sorts of breads and wafers, and it really sounds quite varied. There was an awful lot of stuff that you could actually get hold of from specific pie shops and specific pasty shops and specific cheesecake shops. So it was really interesting. If you wanted a type of food, you went to a shop, a cook shop that supplied that kind of food. Other things that I mentioned are roast beef ribs. That sounds pretty good. Peas cods. Now, peas cod is interesting because it's whole pea pods, complete with the peas inside them, braised or I guess kind of fried in butter with salt. Now, I think that sounds really quite nice, quite a good comfort food, and that sounds great. This one though doesn't sound quite so appetizing for me anyway. Hot sheep's feet. That was definitely on the menu as well. Never seen those in my modern life, and it's not really something I would particularly think I would want to eat. Some cook shops would actually offer a service. They would cook your food for you, so you could bring the ingredients to them and ask them to put those ingredients into a pie, which would then be cooked in their oven, and you would presumably either wait on the premises, hanging around for 20 minutes, half an hour while it was cooked, or you go to the local ale house, have a couple of pots of ale, come back again and get your pie or pasty from the cook shop. I have no idea how they maintained whose pie or pasty was belonging to which customer. Maybe it wasn't that busy, or maybe they just recognised who it was. And I do wonder whether the odd, slightly dodgy cook shop owner might swap out particular ingredients for cheaper ingredients while the client wasn't looking. Unlikely, but not impossible. I have this vision of adventurers going in with certain amounts of food and wanting it to be prepared for them. And so they just offer this food up and go to the pub, literally go to the pub, the ale house or the tavern, and then come back again later and get their pasties and then wander off to do more adventuring while eating pasties. Cook shops were so important in the period that there were quite strict rules about what they could and couldn't do. For example, we know there are written down rules that you're not allowed to throw your dirty water into the middle of the street. I presume you had to put it actually into a cesspit behind your shop, or put it in a barrel and have it taken away later. And you were not allowed to reheat meat as well. There are very specific hygiene rules in some places. You're not allowed to reheat meat, or you'd be fined if you were discovered doing it. I'm sure a few people did though. Some people talk about spices being used to cover up the taste of rotten meat. Well, I want to tell you that that's completely untrue. If you had enough money for posh spices, you certainly had enough money for fresh meat. So the idea that you'd use cinnamon or nutmeg to disguise the taste of rotting meat is absurd if you think about it in detail. Those were very expensive spices. So you had cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger for wealthy people or people with enough money or wanting an expensive pie. But for more ordinary folk, you also had flavourings. You had flavourings like onion and mustard. Those were considered to be lower expense. Those were locally available and could be eaten in quantity by poor people. Whilst there were hygiene rules, it appears that cookshops for poorer people, for clientele that were on the, were destitute or very poor, were also notorious for bad hygiene. In fact, we know quite a lot of this. The poor in towns and cities often lived in tenement buildings. They often didn't even have cooking or washing facilities. They were that poor. They couldn't even cook for themselves. So they had to frequent cookshops, but at the dodgier end, the cheaper end of the cookshop standards. So cookshops were essential for that category of human being. And those cookshops tended to be shunned by the middle class and the upper class completely. And they were much dodgier, and there are a lot of stories to tell about dodgy cookshops. Medieval literature, cookshops that cater to the poor are described in quite lurid terms. Hodge of Ware in the Canterbury Tales is described as a sleazy purveyor of unpalatable food. He is quick to anger, hot-tempered, and prone to drunkenness. His cookshop is described as fly-filled, his food is often reheated, and as a final insult to his cooking prowess, it describes a particularly foul parsley garnish that he uses. Doesn't sound that bad, but I guess parsley garnish was considered to be a bad thing. And from a personal perspective, which is pretty awful for a cook, I suppose, is he's described as having an ulcerated and stinking leg wound. It's a fairly colourful description and probably doesn't represent the majority of cooks. Maybe it does, maybe they were all awful, but I think it's likely there's a bit of personal vendetta going on here. I reckon this is somebody that Chaucer didn't like, and he's describing them in personal terms, perhaps, and it's gone down in history. We'll never know the real person, but somebody got their revenge. Whilst Chaucer's cook may have been a literary invention, we do know through the court records that some of them were dodgy. In 1380, for example, some pastillers were prosecuted for filling their pasties with stinking offal and food that was not fit for consumption, but also for faking the contents of their food. They were accused of putting beef in the pasties and selling it as venison. So there's a bit of passing off there going on. So it doesn't say that the beef pasties were bad, it just says they were lying about the contents. I think that's kind of interesting because there's sort of baking fraud, contents fraud going on there. The fact that cookshops were so important to the poor meant there was legislation, there were rules about what they could and couldn't serve. So for example, we know that was a rule that cookshops in a certain area had to serve pies with meat that were 1 penny, but that were as good as the twopenny pies. I don't really know what that means, but it's a specific rule that they had to follow. Possibly the amount of meat or the quality of meat could vary, but they had to sell penny pies as well as twopenny pies. And the fine for not doing so was 6 shillings and 8pence. There was a much smaller food vendor as well, one without premises, and these walked around with trays of food for reselling. These were called hucksters, and they would often shout out their wares to all and sundry in the street as they wandered around, presumably vying for the best places, presumably trying to sell the food they'd got in front of them as quickly as possible while it was still hot. These actually, for me, remind me very early on when I went to the cinema, where people used to come down and serve ice creams and treats in the interval of the cinema. So they're a kind of huckster, if you like. We even have a record of the sort of thing that might have been shouted out across the streets to sell your food. Piers Plowman is a wonderful poem. It's very dense, it's got a lot of data in it, it's really interesting. But there's a sequence in it where it's described as cooks and their knaves shouting out across the street, and they shout out, hot pies, geese and piglets, come dine, trying to get people into their cookshops to eat at certain times of the day. Imagine that, imagine variations of that everywhere you went on the cook's row, people shouting out their wares. I think that gives quite a lot of colour and depth to the kind of sounds that the medieval street might have been. In the 1370s and 1380s, we have a record of a poet called Thomas Hoccleve, who's reminiscing about his days working as a civil servant in Whitehall. And he talks about at lunchtime going to the taverns and eating and drinking. He drank sweet wine and ate pastries and wafers to the sound of pipe, harp and psaltery. And they're all kinds of musical instrument. And I think that's lovely to think that he was dining at lunchtime and there was music going on as well, medieval music. Whether it was any good or not, I guess we'll never know. But he literally comments on that. So he's eating his wafers and drinking his sweet wine and listening to medieval music on the streets of London. We have another record of a traveller from Venice commenting on London, and he comments about how meat seems to be available everywhere, and there was geese, and there was pork, and there was beef. He also talks about swans and venison in great amounts. He said there was so much food everywhere to be found in London. He doesn't like the English ale, though. He describes it as smelling like horse's piss with bits of husks on the top, and it's cloudy. It seems that fast food in the medieval period was readily available, especially in the larger towns and cities. I think it's really interesting because it was a whole cultural thing. There were occasionally street cafes. There were also places you could go to get a particular type of pie and then some bread and another place for ale. So I imagine quite a lot of people would have been circulating at lunchtime or maybe in the evenings. And I think that gives a different flavour and colour to some medieval cities. It strikes me they were actually much busier and more social places than I'd perhaps thought before. Most of us would have been peasants in the medieval period. What was an ordinary day's work like for an ordinary peasant? Let's find out. About 90 to 95% of the population of medieval England were peasants. Now, peasant really just means somebody that works the land, small-scale farmers, mid-scale farmers, that kind of thing. But basically, the bulk of us were ordinary working small-time farmers, in effect. And the whole bunch of different levels of status within that broad category. I know today peasant tends to mean somebody who's uneducated, unsophisticated, and perhaps that was the case then, but broadly speaking, everybody was fairly unsophisticated and fairly uneducated, unless you were the small minority of nobility or specialist jobs like monk, scrivener, whatever it might be, magistrate, whatever it might be. There were specialist jobs, but they were a tiny minority of the population. So chances are you lived in a small village with 100, 150 friends, relations, extended family members, and your ordinary day was not that dissimilar to the days of an ordinary worker in many ways. The word peasant encompasses a vast group of people. Some were serfs, indentured servants in many ways. They had rights, they had land, but they owned the land they worked the land they lived on behalf of the Lord of the Manor. Now, the Lord of the Manor also had obligations to them, so it's quite complex. It's the feudal system, but there were different levels. So some peasants were quite poor, genuinely quite poor by the standards of the day. There weren't technically slaves at this stage as such, so the lowest of the low were serfs, and they had to work roughly 3 days a week for the Lord of the Manor, more during the harvest and specific times of the day when the Lord of the Manor needed things to be done. As you go up the social hierarchy, you still remain within the broad category of peasant, but you have villeins, cotters, soakmen, who are relatively increasing levels of freedom, to the point where you get freemen who genuinely are individuals that do not owe allegiance to a Lord of the Manor. They may pay rent in terms of actual money instead of service. It depends on the time of history, depends on the geographical location, of course. But there were people who were what we might determine as sort of individual citizens as such. Again, though the concept of being a citizen was not something that would have been familiar to the medieval person, you owed allegiance to the king, effectively. And that king might be king of England and part parts of France and Normandy, and it got complicated basically, but most people knew they had to pay taxes, they had to work for the Northern Manor, and that's what they did in an average day. Most people lived in medieval villages, and a medieval village was a cluster of housing. We would think of them as a little bit like huts in a way. They would vary from very modest one-room shelters with a central hearth to slightly bigger places, but not much more than that. It's unlikely they would be more than 1 story high. There's just no reason you could go backwards into your strip of land behind your property if you needed more space. And most people were outside all the time, and there wasn't much to do when you were inside because it was dark. So it was really for keeping hold of things, keeping it relatively safe, a place to shelter from the bad weather, keep warm, and a place to sleep. Most people worked outside. They would be outside from dawn to dusk. The village itself would be clustered around maybe a crossroads, maybe a stream or river. Decent water source was very important. You would probably drink water, but not perhaps from the river, because rivers are often quite polluted, but from a well or from a spring where you could be fairly confident that no animal had died in it, nobody was dropping their waste, and it wasn't contaminated. People were well aware that bad water would make you ill. You would have a cluster of 30, 40 houses, and on the outside of that, there'd possibly be a church as well, a church or a chapel of various different sizes, depending on the exact time period. And on the outside of that, you'd have the roads out. The roads would go out to what were called great fields. These would be big areas of fields divided into long strips, and each person worked a strip of land. I'll go into the actual dimensions and sizes of that later, but the landscape, unlike modern England, the landscape was probably fairly open. There wouldn't have been hedges as such as the way we understand them today. There would have been coppices and spinneys. There would have been, the woodland, because that was an important resource as well. But these great fields were quite big. They would encompass hundreds of acres sometimes, and there were usually 3 of them, and they were managed in rotation. That's the idealized situation. Sometimes there were more. There were areas of common ground as well. There were even areas of what's known as waste. Now, wasteland conjures up images of destroyed landscapes, but that's not the case. Waste in the medieval period just means not down to agriculture and not really used. So it was a term used in the Domesday Book to describe land that possibly could be brought into cultivation, but actually isn't at the moment. It's just slightly wild, I suppose, possibly overgrown with brambles or whatever it might be, or gorse, whatever the local vegetation was. Quite a useful resource, though, for wildlife, potentially. Most of a peasant's life revolved around working the land and perhaps one day a week going to the local market to stock up on essential goods they couldn't make for themselves. It was a fairly quiet and gentle life most of the time. So when did the day begin? Well, usually it began with people waking up roughly around sunrise. The medieval lifestyle revolved around daylight. You would get up early in the morning.